Welcome to Becoming Parents podcast. I'm your host, Jen Taylor Campbell. I'm a birth and bereavement doula, as well as an adoption and surrogacy doula. Doula means woman who serves. And although I love happy births, adoptions, and surrogacy, the pro bono part of my business is in bereavement. I'm here to help you. I'm also mom of 18, yes, 18 children, with over 30 years experience in the trenches as a mom myself. We have a huge blended family, and I've also experienced the loss of our adult son. Remember, give a shout out to those brave enough to share their stories on how they have become parents. Let's dive in. Welcome to Becoming Parents. Today I have on Connell Michael. Connell, how are you today?
I'm wonderful, thank you.
I'm excited to have you on. I'm going to spoiler alert this by saying you're an attorney, and the title will give that away. You're an attorney and you work with kids that are exceptional, is what you say. And when I read through your information, I thought, wow, where were you? Well, you were in the wrong states, but also where were you when I was going through this process with my son who's autistic? But you're also a mom. So jump into your story, because I don't know which happened first.
So I actually became an attorney before becoming a mom. And I think with most of our kids, we're trying for them, but we don't know when that's actually going to happen. Or you're not trying for one and, and it does happen. It's funny how that works. But I had already become an attorney and I was working at a healthcare law firm at the time. And I just remember with my first baby thinking, oh, I'll just find, childcare. It'll be easy. I'll bounce
Mhm.
back. Everything is going to be, simple. I'm going to be really organized about it. And becoming a parent is very life changing, not because it just simply changes your life, but it has to change your mentality
Mhm.
as to how you deal with the world, where you think your boundaries and limits are, exceeding those limits in some areas, and also creating boundaries and making lifestyle changes. And I think women especially find that really huge life change is much more than they expected, and I certainly did.
Oh, yeah. I think people, they date someone and move in and get married, and they think this is so huge, and I just sit back thinking, actually, not to minimize that is a big deal, but then you have a child, and interestingly, most people are like, yeah, we're just going to adjust and move on. And as a doula, I had an interview yesterday with somebody, and I was like, I'm not going to tell her how off base she is, because maybe it will work out the way she thinks it will work out. Probably not. But it's just interesting to me that we think this getting married or moving in with somebody is like this huge life change, but then we're going to have a baby and just like bounce back and no big deal. And it's the opposite.
It is. And I remember asking one of my friends shortly after the birth of my first Alex, when does life go back to normal? And her response was, it doesn't go back to normal. What happens is that there's a new
New
normal.
normal. Yeah.
And I remember because I guess and my daughter Alexandra, who I call Alex, she must have been 6 or 8 weeks then, but I was feeling sleep deprived. You can't go out. Your life changes to such a degree, and you're thinking, how am I going to be able to go to a dinner party again? How do I find a babysitter? Like, where do you even start with finding a babysitter? Um,
Right.
all of these things were going through my mind at that time, and I think for first time parents, it's that goes through your mind not only at week 6 and 8 and 12 and 6 months and a year. And that's what actually really led to my changing my area of law in some respects, because you get a new understanding of what it means to be a parent, and the obligations you take on, because the obligations of becoming a parent are far beyond any other obligations you're going to accept in your life, right? It's far beyond marriage. You're not financially necessarily responsible for someone for 18 years. You're married to them. You can, but legally, it is a complete change, right? And I think it also pushes us so much out of our comfort zone. Where and I'm somebody who I always had pets. I had horses that I had to care for, but caring for a child is so fundamentally different. And so that was, I mean, that was the first thing, is that I had an idea, as that if I organized it and if I planned well enough, that this wouldn't be that complex, it wouldn't be that difficult. And parenting, while being so wildly rewarding,
Hmm.
is often, I think, the one of the most complex things we do, right? I think if you're talking to somebody who, let's say they're in nuclear physics, they would say my relationships with my child and even raising a child are actually far more complex. And it's
Right.
something that it doesn't, it's not that necessarily that hard to do, right? To have a child, but the obligations that you then take on. But that's what changed my dynamic, because my background had been in healthcare and then healthcare law, and I had had some special education cases. And once I had my child, you start to realize the cases that I had had early on, and I think Jen, you and I have talked about them in the past, were cases involving, for instance, children who had cancer, who their
Yeah.
parents are trying to get them eligible for special education, children who had dyslexia. All of a sudden, you are looking at these cases, which before had been very, very abstract, and you're seeing what a family is trying to go through sometimes to get even the most simple services. And it changes the dynamic. I think it's sort of like for individuals who are navigating the healthcare system, right? You might see it very differently when you're outside of it, and how hard it is to navigate, how hard it is to get a diagnosis, how hard it is to get insurance to cover things. I think we all have a different view when we're outside of that system. Once you're inside and
Hmm.
you're dealing with it, it changes your view entirely. And so I had my daughter Alex, and that was the same time I was making the transition into education law. And, it started where I had those cases involving children who were critically ill. And it was a very different viewpoint when I'm trying to, raise a child, care for a baby, and still practice law. And it also is what initiated me actually starting my own firm, because I realized women can't do the 8 to 5 that we thought would, at least I at the time, that I thought I'd be able to jump into with a 6 week old baby. I realized I just
Yeah.
didn't feel comfortable taking her to daycare. I didn't have family who lived near. And I said, I really have to do this in a very, very different way.
I love that. And I think a lot of us hit that point and we're like, wait. I firmly believe that you don't have to stop doing anything that you did before. Like I was a runner, but it looks different. Now I'm pushing a running stroller. Now I'm
Yes.
basing it off of nap time. Now I'm so did I still run? Yeah, I still ran. Did not look or feel the same, and you just have to take kind of a step back and think, "Okay, how can I can do anything that I did before, but so how can I do that?" I don't think your life has to stop and everything has to
Mhm.
change, but you do need to take a step back and figure out the how. I can do
Yes.
it. How? What does that look like? And so yeah, I completely get it, I think with everything. So you don't need to stop practicing law, but how are you gonna do it, and what does
And
that
how
look
do I
like?
adapt it, right?
Right.
And that adaptation actually led me to a much greater achievement than I ever would have,
Right.
right? Sitting at a law firm desk trying to go through the 2000 hours that I would need to as an associate. It actually pushed me to say, how do I adapt my life to this? How do I
Right.
keep doing what I'm doing, but in now a way that I love and care about very differently than I have in the past, because I have an understanding of it. And then how do I make it work?
Right.
And when I got into education law, it was something I could do a lot at home. And a lot of my calls, even now, the day and age of Zoom or conference
Yep.
calls, you are having to wait while I was on a call earlier. But I realized there were things I could do from home while I was carrying a baby around the house.
Yep.
And it was one of those things that I also realized, if I was on the phone with a parent and a baby started crying in the background, they weren't about to say, sorry, you know what, I need to go find a male attorney or someone who doesn't have a baby that they're trying to care for. Parents also understood.
Right.
Hearing officers would understand, hey, can we set this hearing out a bit so that I can make sure that I have childcare arrangements made? And that is what really propelled me forward in education law. And now, as you know, I do probably more of it than most people in the whole Midwest. But that's what propelled it is I could do that with a baby on my hip and then a second baby on the other. And it really, I have sort of a funny thing I want to tell you that I ended up doing. I would have all of my law clerks and associates actually come to my house. I had an office in downtown Indianapolis at the time, but I got a blow up pool and I moved all the furniture out of my living room. And I put the pool, this big blow up thing. So the sides were inflated, the bottom was flat, and when I had toddlers, they had the whole living room, right, where they could play with their toys, but they couldn't get out. They couldn't run into a wall, right? The living room was carpeted. So if they tripped while they're playing, and I put my desk right at the front of this really large blow up pool. Again, the bottom's not inflated, but I created for myself this ginormous equivalent of a playpen. And yet I could be sitting there on my laptop watching them, talking to them, still interacting with my children while I worked. And I think that goes to, we may be running, but we're going to run differently. We may be
Right.
working, but how do we work differently? And how do we survive that and have it really make it work for us?
Oh, I love that. I think that that's so fun. You ended up expanding. I don't know if you expanded later on. You're in Texas, Indiana, and Michigan. So, unfortunately, for people who are not in Texas, Indiana, and Michigan, you couldn't have helped me in Nevada necessarily, but
We would give you a good referral. We would try and give you a
right.
good referral. But yeah, that's the problem. I am in Ohio now as well,
Okay.
so we're there. But there are attorneys who do what I do, which is represent parents of children who have special needs, who have what are called educational due process cases. And they're all over the United States. I mean, there's
Mhm.
not a lot in every state, but you can usually find someone who does it. And then I also do personal injury of children now and disabled adults. So I've been doing that for a while as well.
I saw that you work with sexual assault and rape victims. So we're totally tangenting on this, which I love. You can just go straight into that. I love hearing about what you're doing well, as a parent, you know what it feels like to have somebody in your corner that
Yes.
sees you, that is listening,
Yes.
that's like, "Oh, wait, there's something that you can do," because we feel as parents so often like at a loss. Am I doing enough? Is what I'm doing right? Is there something that I don't know about? Am I not asking the right questions? And you bridge that gap with these situations.
Yeah, and I think that that's one thing that we want in life. Life is very unpredictable, and law is very scary. Parenthood is very scary in some ways, but when you're dealing with some type of conflict or a type of injury, or there are so many things I think that can happen where at times you just want somebody to listen and tell you if you're down the right path,
Yeah,
you're headed in the right direction. What can you do? And other times it's really helping guide people through what are often really horrible, difficult situations. And I think that's where I try and be very cognizant and look at every situation as what if this was me, right?
right.
If this was my child and I was coming to talk to an attorney, right? We're already on guard. It's the same way I think a lot of people feel, whether you walk into a doctor's office or you walk into a lawyer's office or you walk into an accountant's office, you don't know everything, right? So you already feel a little on guard. With attorneys, people are really concerned about their finances.
Mhm.
They're concerned about, I don't, most of the time, again, by the time people get to me, they've already, run the gamut of trying to resolve things on their own, or something really tragic has happened. And so it's taking them from that to how do we at least create some sort of peace of mind and give you some predictability, and here's how things are going to work, and really as clearly as possible helping them understand. And I think that's where, all of us, whether you're a parent or you're not, understand what it's like to be in someone's shoes and encountering difficult situations or things that I think feel unfamiliar to us.
I know even if there's an experience that we were just chatting and you said, "Oh, I had this experience with my child that I hadn't experienced." Once you're a parent, that doesn't matter anymore. I'm like, I
Yes.
feel for you. I know what it would be like for me to experience that thing. And so I know I think it's so interesting once you became a parent, you like your kids didn't need to have any disability, any issue. There didn't need to be that. Just becoming a parent made you realize when parents entered the system, like you were saying, like,
Yes.
holy cow, what would it be like for me to enter this system and have no idea? And you get to advocate for those parents, which is incredible. You had your second baby 2 years later. So by that time, were you pretty had the you had started your own lawn firm, you'd switched gears, and you had a pool and a system. Like, you
I
had it
had a
all set up.
pull-in assistant, and it really worked, spectacularly for me.
Right.
And that was the great thing. Law clerks didn't mind coming to the house. They didn't mind, being really actively involved. That was what worked, really well for me, for a whole variety of reasons. I mean, it
Mhm.
really did. And but that said, right, you're doubling up. You have double the time commitments. And so that's where you have to guard your time as well. And
Yeah.
to this day, I still walk that line. I'm headed out. One of my daughters, who's in college, moved from one apartment to another, and I'm headed out next week to make sure everything is done with that. That she's happily into the new place. So it doesn't change even when they're older. But it's okay. What do I have this week that I need to balance? Because
Mhm.
that's also the other thing, is that your priorities dramatically change. And I think most of us, before we have children, our priority is our own well-being, which it should be, right? I mean, we care for our parents, right? We care for our siblings. But when you have children, it changes to where you realize there's this responsibility from individuals who are truly dependent. And so that is one of those things that, for all the moms or dads listening, it really is, how do we adapt our lives not only when our kids are young but older, so we're still preserving our well-being and how much we can do, and making sure though that we're still fulfilling our obligations to our children, because we are, as I tell every parent, you're your child's really their only true advocate.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think that parents forget that. And, one thing I can say from, doing either healthcare law and advocacy, especially with children, and then education law now, total for over 23 years, is
Mhm.
that I see parents who have this belief that children are adults at 18 and you can throw your hands up. And that is the worst possible thing a parent can do. I see many kids who get lost once they get into a college system, or who end up with hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt because there's nobody guiding them or advising them or helping them. Um, and I see kids who, during their teenage years, parents also just throw up their hands. And those are the ones that lead to these outcomes that really aren't the best. And so that's one thing I learned, is that this is not a job that suddenly stops.
Right.
And, I think that there are parents out there with this philosophy, and they probably, these are parents from another generation, right? Where they may have joined the military at 18. They may have certain perceptions. Their parents may have said, it's up to you at 18. But long term, and again, this is from hundreds and hundreds of cases over the years, the parents who stay actively involved, and that's very different from being a helicopter parent, the parents who stay actively involved and continue to provide guidance, um, love. If you don't have the financial means, that's not what's necessary, but it's providing the guidance and the love to the best of your ability, really can make or break a young person very early in their life.
I love I've loved most of my kids are adults, and so I've loved that when they became adults and they didn't have to come to me anymore. Like, I wasn't disciplining them. When they come to you with a problem, they're not necessarily asking you to fix it, but they've chosen to have the conversation with me when they could have chosen to have it with someone else. And I think that's like the biggest gift when your kids come to
Yes.
you and you're the one that they want to have the conversation with. Um,
Yes.
and you get to be a safety net, and safety net doesn't necessarily mean they live in your basement until they're 40. It can mean lots of different things, right? Because my kids don't live with me. My adult kids don't live with me. They have off and on, but that's not how I'm supporting them. I'm supporting them in all these other ways. And you just have to figure out in what ways can you support them best and that they want that, which is
Hmm.
outstanding. So I agree. And I know that for you, because it was the same for me, because both of your kids are now adults, they're over
Yeah.
18, right?
Right.
As they grew up, the pool changed, using that changed to
Yes.
different things. And you adapted with that and your hours and how you did things and what you were able to do. I totally agree. I think any one of us, especially women that have our own businesses, shutting it off. I mean, I have to set hours for myself because it's a 24/7 thing.
Yes. And, that was one thing I found is that, especially like when my children were in elementary school, they still, they really need you after school, right? School ends at 2:30. So there were a few things that I did, and it depends on how, what somebody's doing for a living, but I really tried to adapt my schedule to that
Yep.
8 to 2:30. And then when I started to have a much greater load, that was where I would have other attorneys or associates really help me and those, after 2:30, you had to know I can't have a call scheduled. I need you to take that on for me. And I really tried to adapt that. That being said, the advantage was, as if I needed to talk to a parent and do an evening call, again, if I have kids in the background, I think that
Yep.
most families I found were just appreciative. I'm doing a call with them in the evening or the weekend. So again, it made my field very adaptable compared to if I had been doing corporate law and they're hearing kids play in the background. It may have been a little bit different. But I mean, the one message there is that you can do this, right? You can adapt your life and have a full-time life as a parent and have a full-time life in your career. It all comes to how you adapt that and how you change that. And it does take some creativity.
Hmm.
I mean, I remember when I was actually going to start my own firm, it was one of those situations of I'm going through in my mind, how am I going to meet with clients? Do I need to have an office? How much is it going to cost me with an office? Right. And how much rent am I going to have to pay? And do I
Right.
have to, and this is in the days before we had all the remote, where you could do the answering service. Do I need to have a secretary there? How much is that going to cost me? Well, and I have a newborn. And so it's really figuring that out, but it's also pushing ahead and knowing that it's not only doable, sometimes these are the things that really push you to excel and also set extraordinarily phenomenal examples for your kids. I
Right.
mean, to this day, my kids remember these things, right? They remember the little toddler pool. They remember some of my phone calls. I mean, in Indianapolis, we have a children's museum. And so there were areas of it that I would take them because I knew it was quieter and they could play and I knew I could hop on a call on, for instance, they had teacher training days and I still needed to do some calls. I needed to work on some things. So I think that's the biggest message for moms who are still trying to figure it out is that there are many things you can do to create an adaptable life. Um, I've actually had a few friends go back to school to become teachers because there's such a teaching shortage right now. And one of the things driving them is they have young children and they want to have a job where they can get off when their children get off,
Hmm.
where they can have some more of that time during the summers. And so, regardless of what you're doing now, whether you want to excel in that and just find a way to make it more adaptable, because there's some jobs where you're sort of stuck being there until 5,
Right.
but there are things you can do to change that dynamic.
And I love that. I think I wanted to point it out a little bit more in depth, which you did, because I want to encourage women who want to move forward with a career or are having trouble balancing that it is hard and it is doable. I want to switch gears and talk about coffee with Catherine, and it's actually coffee and cocktails, which I loved. When I saw that, I was like, yes, I love this. So you have the law firm and you do that, and you have
Yeah.
this job and you did your kids. And then when did Coffee with Catherine start and why? And how is that different?
Yeah, so I actually started that because I just wanted a place where parents could. We originally started weekly. Now we do monthly meetings. We do one in the evening and one on Saturday morning. But I wanted a place where parents could come and start, no matter what state they were in, right? Whether they're in
Yes.
Nevada or
Hmm.
Idaho, and just have somebody providing them information on law, advocacy, navigating the medical system, a place where they could actually hear somebody talking about it and they could ask questions. And it's information, it's not legal advice, we always have to say. But part of the problem that I dealt with many clients, and I certainly understand, is you can go online and do lots of searches, find lots of things. It's putting it together and even knowing how to use it.
Yeah.
And it's also even, you might start to understand the law in terms of, let's say, an IEP for your child, but not necessarily know how to go in and get some of those additional goals. Get counseling services. We have parents who never knew that a school would be required to pay for a residential placement for their child who had a mental health disorder, right? They're trying to go through their insurance company, which is denying things. They're calling 911, going to the emergency room all the time. They live in a state that doesn't have a lot of education attorneys and they're trying to navigate it. I wanted a place where somebody could go and join, just even once a month. We tried to make it really affordable and basically just cover the costs of the site where they can actually just get information. Because that is one of the things I think that is a problem right now is there are so many internet sites with so much
Yeah.
information. We find that some of it is wrong. Some of it is not applicable. If you're a parent who lives in New York, reading a site that somebody has in California, it doesn't give you the guidance you actually need. I'll give you a quick example. One thing that a parent can receive is if you have a child who you believe should be qualified for special education services, or you have a child who is what's called an independent educational evaluation. This means you can go and find a psychologist or neuropsychologist in your state and have your child independently tested outside of the school so you can see how are they actually performing, what are their grade level, what needs do they have, and that you can do that if you disagree with the school's evaluation. Well, in some states the school has to get back to you in 10 days. In other states it's a reasonable time. In other states it's 20 days. And so what we find is we get parents who come to us and send questions saying the school didn't get back to me in 10 days, and they're in California and California says a reasonable time. And what
Hmm.
happens is these parents are just going online and they're just trying to get information and they're not able to put it together, which most of us probably wouldn't be able to, right? It's like it's researching a medical diagnosis and you see here are the 20 treatments. So I really wanted to provide something, at least on one topic, where we could really concentrate, ask questions, provide information, and really give parents a guidepost as to how to handle those situations.
I loved it when I mean, I loved looking at your website where you're an attorney, and if you're in those states and people need you, that's a great resource. But when you find somebody, if I had found your law firm at the time that I was searching, it would have been one more thing that felt deflating in an already deflated situation, an already frustrated situation. Because I had 2 kids with IEPs, but one was autistic, and navigating that was so challenging. If I had seen that website, I would have been like, "Oh," and, like, she can't help me either. So, the fact that you have this Coffee with Catherine would have meant for me, like, "Oh my gosh, it's somebody who I can at least ask questions to." So, I was so excited when I saw your website, because at the beginning, I was like, "If you're in these states, you can help," and now I'm saying, if you're in any of the states, you can still help in a different way, because you're right, just understanding, and I did a good job. Looking back, he's 24 now, and retrospectively looking at it, I did a good job. Could it have been better and less stressful, and could I have done more? I don't know. And that's the thing, parents in this situation, you want to make sure, oh, yes, I'm totally on track, and these are the right things. And you give that to parents. And again, I know what it's like to be that parent sitting in that. wanting to just be able to ask questions to just organize it in your brain because it's so
Yes,
overwhelming, and
it
that's
is.
what you do, so I'm so thankful and proud
Well,
of
it
you.
is. And one of those things that, along those lines, when parents are looking back, I have a friend of mine who she has older children now, and she was like, I wish I had known about the vocational programs I could have asked for my child.
Oh my gosh,
Um,
yeah,
because she didn't know that under federal law, her child could have stayed in the school system till his 22nd birthday. So
right.
they were hiring all these tutors, pushing him through, doing all of this stuff at their own cost, which a lot of parents can't do. And she felt like she was never informed. So it's like when we're looking back, right? Hindsight is always 2020, and we
Yep,
all do the best we can with what we know. And I think that's the thing. And there's a reason why the quote knowledge is power is such a
mhm,
powerful one. It's because it really is. And
yeah,
most of us only do what we know. We do the best we can with what we know at that time. But the more we know, the better we can do. And I think that then becomes the responsibility. When we talk about becoming parents,
yeah,
it's becoming knowledgeable in things that were far outside of our comfort zones, right? It's becoming comfortable with negotiation techniques, right? You've been at the IEP table.
oh
It's
yes,
getting comfortable with having to even disagree with someone at times, because most human beings, thankfully, I shouldn't say most, a good portion of us tend to be non confrontational, right? We want to get along with others, we want to find ways to work things out.
yeah,
And I think sometimes parents, they'll get to this IEP table and they're shocked to be told no when they're asking for sometimes very simple services for their child. And it's then knowing how
yep,
to push and how to push with grace and diplomacy. And if you have to take legal action, you're doing so in a in a way that's going to be effective because you have the grounds to do so.
yeah,
And that's what takes parents right from this state of frustration, right? And I think we get frustrated because we don't know what to do, right? We get frustrated when we feel cornered and we feel like we don't have options. And the whole world starts to open up when you see the options, right? You see the doors that can be opened. You see the various paths to the goal. And that is one thing that parenting does, I think, for all of us, is it starts to expand those horizons. And it certainly did for me. One of my first cases, I remember thinking I would do it was an eligibility case for a child with
mm,
dyslexia. And I was pregnant with Elizabeth at that time, and I did not want this case to go through an educational due process hearing. And I was a young attorney at that time. I had only been practicing in education law at that point about 3 years, and it was this fear of I just want this school to do what they need to do. This child is in 10th grade. He's reading at a first grade level. And I remember, and I think you and I talked about this earlier, Jen, but I was shocked that schools weren't doing what they were supposed to do just automatically. For someone who, yeah, came from other areas of law, it was shocking, right? It was this splash of cold water in the face. You're going to fight me. You're going to spend, $50,000, $100,000 fighting to keep a child from learning to read. I to this day sometimes still deal with grappling with the illogic um, of sometimes what school corporations will do. But that case was one in which I didn't want to have to go through it. I was going to
yeah,
have to spend a week away, find childcare for my other one, have my husband try and juggle that, go 8 months pregnant to an educational due process hearing for 4 days. And it pushed me way out of my comfort zone as to and I kept thinking, there must be some reason they're fighting me on this, right? The other shoe's going to drop. Maybe could I be wrong on the law, right? Why are they fighting so hard? And I kept trying to be really kind. I offered at that point in time, I'll waive all my attorney's fees, just make this child eligible for special education, provide him some reading services. And they said that fastly refused. And so I was forced to go through a hearing. And I think the reason that things like this actually start to matter to all parents is it not only took me out of my comfort zone, it tore me out of my comfort zone. I had to go through a full 4 day hearing. And I, again, kept thinking, did I have something wrong? It was clear that the child was eligible. Hearing officer ruled for the parent on all counts. I got all my attorney's fees, but I never would have done that unless I had pushed myself over that hurdle of I'm having to fight with someone. It's simply me attending an IEP and negotiating on behalf of a school. It's not me simply sending a letter on letterhead. It's not us simply, filing for a hearing and resolving it in mediation. It's me going into a situation with a school that has multiple attorneys and has said, you know what, if you want to pursue this, be prepared to go to hearing. And so that is the thing as parents, not just as attorneys. There are going to be times that we have to truly advocate for our child or for a friend's child, or in a situation where you're doing parent advocacy, because there are a lot of parents out there where we're really pushed to do things that we're deeply uncomfortable doing, but we know that the end result is what's going to be the true benefit for that child. But that was really hard for me. Again, that was, more than 20 years ago now, but it really puts things in that context. And it changed how I practiced. Hearings were no longer scary, right? I had done the first one, and
Right.
it had been positive. And then I did the second one, but I never. I mean, because in other areas of law, you don't end up in a trial unless, for instance, if you're in criminal law, prosecutors pretty sure they've got a good case, or in civil law, the other side, knows the law and it's questionable. In education, I learned that just wasn't the case. Schools had learned if they pushed families, that they would back down, that they would go away, that they would move out of district, that they would homeschool their child, that they would stop pushing, that they would pay for services privately. So what I encountered was simply what they had learned to make families go away. And
Wow.
yeah, but I mean, at the time, you're right. I wouldn't have necessarily known that. I was still trying to find my way. But that is, as a parent, especially if you're a parent out there listening and you have a child on an IEP, there are times that things are going to be tiring. They're going to be hard. They're going to really take
Yep.
you out of that comfort zone. But and that's why I even love the title here, because it's becoming, and
Right.
it's becoming what is our highest good, and our highest potential, as a human being. And I think that we need some of these things to push us to those points, because we often don't go on our own.
I I love that you said, like, I know you were pregnant, you were very pregnant and this whole thing, but parents often back down when they shouldn't. And you're the attorney with the training that's ready to go and still was like, you were like, maybe I should back down. I mean, it's empowering to parents that, like, just keep going, get the information
Yes.
and do what you need to, but don't back down. That's a bully tactic and it's working. And that makes me
Right.
so angry.
It's worked so effectively, right? There are school districts out there in some states where, a parent files against them, and they basically, that's the tactic they take, is bullying, because most of us, right, as I say, most people are non-confrontational. They leave the system or they move.
Right.
And that's exactly the wrong thing to do, because the problem is it's sort of, it leaves the system to the bullies, and it creates more success with that behavior.
Right.
And they learn and they get worse. I mean, there are school districts, still today, that I know we're going to have a fight on our hands. They will spend 100 times more money fighting a parent than they will providing that child or even their teacher's support. But it's because those are long learned tactics. But that goes, to parents who are out there listening. You've got to just come back to, what is my job? And your job is to advocate for your child, whether, again, that's in education, healthcare advocacy. I had a case, this was a while back, but it was a child who the pediatrician had diagnosed with ADHD. And the parent comes to me and says, my child's diagnosed with ADHD, and here's all the struggles. But I got to be honest with you, I don't think my child has ADHD. I think there's something else going on. And I said, well, I think you should pursue that. Why don't you think that something, why do you think it's something else? And she's giving me, some of the symptoms, like child fell asleep during the day at times. Child just seems like he looks exhausted. He's bouncing off the walls, but looks exhausted. She followed up with the pediatrician. Pediatrician didn't do anything. I gave her a referral to a neurologist who I knew at the office, just, here's something to check out. Turned out the child had a extraordinarily severe case of sleep apnea. And this kiddo was waking up about, I think it was 140 times a night. Actually ended up having surgery. It was so severe it was unable to be remediated with a sleep apnea machine. Um, and then the child, went back to what we would perceive normal. And
Right.
and and that's why I encourage parents to keep down that path, because there are other cases I've had. A recent one was a child who had a mitochondrial disorder, and the parent had been on the child about, you're not trying hard enough, you're not working hard enough. One of the things the parent said to me when they first came to my office is, my child is very lazy and unmotivated. I'm really frustrated with the school. We've been dealing with lots of suspensions. Now we're dealing with an expulsion, and I don't know what to do. And so I'm going through this child's medical records, and I'm seeing throughout the records, fatigue, doesn't try hard enough, and doesn't try hard enough again and again and again. And I actually called the pediatrician. We called some other providers. Child ended up being diagnosed with a mitochondrial disorder, which was why they had been exhausted for the last decade, and unable to keep up academically. Their room was a mess, but their room was a mess because they were exhausted. And so that's why I say, to parents, you've got to actually always look at the full spectrum of what's going on with your child.
Mhm.
Um, and it's most of us don't want to be called lazy. Most of us aren't going to naturally be unmotivated. Now, kids may be messy, right? I mean, that's part of childhood in some respects, and for some parents, it's part of adulthood as well. And I will say there are days where it's part of my adulthood, but in the grand scheme of things, again, this is where we have to get outside of our comfort zone, because it's really easy, whether we're saying it about as a parent or we're saying it about another person, to say they're just not trying. And I think that's another message for parents, is if you're having a problem with your child, actually getting to the why of it, versus writing it off with they're lazy, or they're not doing what they should do, or I just have an oppositional child. Is actually starting to say, what can I still do to support this child? What other options can I explore, and what stone have I actually left that I may need to turn? Um,
Right.
the saying "leave no stone unturned" I think is especially true, because in both of these situations, if the parent hadn't been pushed, the child with ADHD would have continued having severe sleep apnea, which would have led to all sorts of health problems, probably by their early 20s. The child with the mitochondrial disorder probably would have, ended up not graduating high school, dropping out, laying around the house. Nobody's Because no one would be going in and truly advocating for that child and say, what is actually the problem? Something's not right.
Right. Oh, Catherine, I love what you do. It makes my heart so happy. Thank you so much. And thank you for being on and sharing your story. There's so much in this episode that people can get a lot out of, whether it's their own needs with their kids or just the support of working. I just really appreciate you. Thank you so much for being on.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And I really appreciate your podcast. I feel like it's so informative. It is such a good resource for
Thank you.
parents. I mean, I feel like it's actually such a good resource for people in general. I mean, the topics are phenomenal. I'm really grateful that you had me on.
Thank you so much.